this year. Interesting Purim, and always we learn a little bit from reflecting on the story of Esther. Our frame of mind changes, whether it's stuff going on in the news or just who we are as people or what we've experienced as people since the last time we read it, whether it was at Purim or like we did a few months ago. We read it in our Tuesday Torah study class. We went through the book of Esther over a couple of weeks, got a chance to kind of dig a little deeper into it. Tonight is our last in our six-part history of the Jews. This is
Excuse me,
this is
Rabbi.
the yeah,
Before we get into
yeah,
new business,
yeah,
uh, last week I was online. I was
yep.
able to watch whatever. The only way I could continue watching was without audio or video. The machine wouldn't even find my camera.
Ooh,
I had to reboot the machine all as well. Uh, there was a lot of discussion about the issues that came out of the Ukraine. My father's family were all from an area that was called Bessarabia,
mhm,
Moldova. Uh,
yep.
my father grew up in Kishinev.
Mhm.
And when you talk about people that survived the pogroms in that area, rather than talking about it in generality of people that I heard of, people I knew, my father was there. My father was an infant. The entire family was hidden in the outhouse during one of the pogroms. And my father, apparently, as I'm told the story by one of my aunts, my father's sister, was crying. They couldn't shut him up. And a neighbor who was hiding in the outhouse with him suggested that they suffocate him so that he didn't give them all away. And I am very, very grateful that that my family did not listen to that, and my father, my grandmother, and my aunts and uncles did, in fact, survive that pogrom. However, their father, my grandfather, was dragged out of the house and, as I'm told, beaten to death in the street. So, the discussions of that have a lot of it hits home.
Yeah. And we talked about we last week we kind of talked about pogroms bookended with the Holocaust, which I mentioned in some ways was a unique aspect of history and Jewish history, but in some ways a culmination of years and years of similar types of activity, right? So on one hand, unique because of the scale and the scope, and also unfortunately part of a continuum at the same time. The and we do not speak of the Holocaust a lot, and that's because again we're going to have another class and maybe two classes about the Holocaust, but the Shoah, and actually probably fairly close to when Yom HaShoah Day will be. But we're also today going to be talking about Israel. We're talking about 1945. We kind of finished with the Holocaust this last week. This week we're kind of talking about the birth of Israel and then to the modern era. And then we will also be having some classes that just focus on the history of Israel, probably three classes that deal with the history of Israel. So these classes that we're kind of going through some of these things very quickly, it's because there's going to be another place, another time for us to kind of dig, to kind of focus on those. But right now, it's more for you to see it in the continuum of Jewish history, to be able to place these things on a timeline and to understand where they're at in relation to each other. And even doing it over 6 weeks, I know it's hard to do that, but we're building on it. And so last week we finished around 1945, and like I said, and by no means talking about the Holocaust for about 15, 20 minutes, do we even scratch the surface of the impact and what we learned from it, et cetera. But um, as I kind of left off last time, we also have to recognize that to a large extent, the Holocaust, the Nazi campaign against the Jews was successful, that the obliteration of the European Jewish community was largely successful. There were not many parts of Europe that had Jews left after by the end of 1945. So This chart here shows you the countries where there were Jews during the war. When we look at again what happened in Poland, to consider, that 3 million out of 3.4 million Jews were murdered there means again that 90% of the Jewish community there was wiped out. Um, in the Soviet Union, which was the country with the next largest population that was murdered, primarily in Ukraine, you can see that was about a third of the Jewish community that was wiped out there, but in whole numbers. So there was a large Jewish community left in the Soviet Union after World War II, and it was a and it still is in the countries that make up the former Soviet Union, countries like Russia, um, and Ukraine. There was even, by the way, a fairly large Jewish community still left in Moldova in Kishinev after the war. But but in real terms, obviously, in pure numbers, you can see how many Jews were murdered there. Um, in some countries, the number of Jews that were killed were not necessarily as high. And this, what makes this chart essentially kind of, it's the numbers of people that were there in those countries before the war. But you can see in some of the countries, like in Lithuania, again, 90% of the Jews were murdered. But then you go
Mhm.
to other countries, and this is the interesting thing. You go, well, wait, Nazi Germany, Nazi Germany, Nazi Germany, only about one third of the Jews of Nazi Germany were murdered.
Mhm.
Two-thirds of the Jews of Germany survived.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And people like Margot Webb, and you wonder, and that's because when the Nazis, and of course you can see 1933, when that country became fell under the Nazi regime, the Third Reich, there was literally 9 years for Jews to essentially get out of that country before the Wannsee Conference, which we
And they
mentioned
wanted them
in
out. They
1942. And for 10 years almost, Jews figured out ways, in some cases, again, beg, borrowed, and steal, to get a passport, to get any way to get out of the country. A lot of Jews did get out of the country. And interestingly, of those 165,000 who were murdered, many of those were elderly people who had either given up their spaces, like Margot's grandparents, who were all murdered, all four of them, but they had given up their spaces for her and her parents to get out of the country. So many elderly people just didn't want to start over. They just didn't want to deal with it, and in some cases knew by the time that they gave up those passes that they were not leaving Germany alive. So it's a weird thing to think about. And again, in the Hungarian Jewish community, also allies of the Nazis, most of these Jews that were killed, almost 300,000, were only murdered during the last 6 months of the war. Because when Hungary was as an ally of the Nazis, they actually were able to preserve their Jewish community for longer, keep them alive for longer, because they actually didn't turn them over. Same thing in Italy. You can see how few Jews were killed that were murdered in Italy. It wasn't a large community, it was only 46,000 before the war, but you can see a fraction of them were killed because Mussolini would not turn the Jews over to be murdered. So it's a very interesting thing. We'll talk about it more when we get to the Holocaust. It's crazy irony that the Axis countries, countries like Italy, countries like Bulgaria, I mean, Bulgaria was, by the way, one of the craziest because Bulgaria had a decent sized Jewish community, about 50,000, and you could see almost the whole country was able to spare their Jews. So Bulgaria was an ally of the Nazis. Hungary was an ally of the Nazis. Were part of the Axis. They were able to spare their Jews. So it's an interesting kind of weird, if you will, aspect of the history. But most of these countries, again, the Jewish community is wiped out. There are not many Jews that even want to live in Germany after the war. So the ones who survived, again, most of them by the end of 1945 are no longer in Germany. They're in the United States. They're in Australia. They're in South Africa, and a lot of them, of course, have come to Israel. Because when we talk about how did we make sense of this kind of catastrophe, obviously, if Jews had been able to immigrate to Israel during 1945, up till 1945, so many more would have been able to survive. So again, when we think about, and I showed you this map before, I mean this chart before, you can see that the Jewish community here in in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe by 1940 by 1948 is it's completely different. And now you start to see a greater percentage, even though the real numbers don't look bigger. You can see that the Jewish community,
Starts there.
the red is us, the red is us and Australia, but there's not that many Jews in Australia. There's 150,000, 200,000 Jews in Australia after the war. But by the way, Melbourne has had the largest community of Holocaust survivors of any city in the world. We're in Melbourne, Australia, of survivors of a city. I mean, there's more. There were more survivors in the United States. There were many more survivors in Israel, but of a city with Holocaust survivors, it was Melbourne. Um, so you can see how it changes from 1939 before the war starts to what it looks like after. The Jewish community looks completely different in the sense that there's now a greater section of Jews that are now in Israel, and of course Eastern Europe has gone down tremendously. That's Poland, Russia, Ukraine, and then this area, while it hasn't gone up that much, you have the murder of nearly 6 million Jews. That area now is so much bigger. And of course, what we're going to get to in our day is the fact that today most of the Jewish community lives either here in the United States, Canada, Australia, and Israel. So, how do we get from this situation where Jews are pretty much just in Europe in 1880, the beginning of the 1900s, beginning of the 20th century, everyone will look at it just over 100, about 150 years ago, when most of our grandparents and great grandparents were immigrating because of pogroms, how this becomes this. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So, after the Holocaust, like so many other tragedies that had happened to the Jews before, there's a different demographic, a different national um, uh, circumstances that are at play. And so what happens is we have new countries in some cases where there never were Jews, right? And so it's one thing when we've had these kind of this kind of stuff in the past where Jews were in Germany in 1000, then they go to Poland, and then they come back to Germany in the 1800s. There were Jews, there was a Jewish history in those countries. In the United States, we don't have that. And then, of course, we're also going to be really, again, getting into it in a couple of weeks, but we are going to talk about it today as far as putting the chronology together, the rise of Israel, and the fact that literally, as Jews are escaping Europe and then leaving displaced persons camps in Germany, in in Austria, in parts of Europe, Western Europe, they are literally leaving displaced persons camps, DP camps, where in some cases they were there for 3 or 4 or even 5 years in a camp, not a concentration camp, a camp they can go in and out of, but still not a home. These people had no homes left in many cases. And of course, DP camps were not just for Jews. DP camps were for people from all different backgrounds, people who had lost their homes, people who, again, in some cases were pretending like they weren't Nazis, but we know that they were, sometimes in the same areas as Jewish survivors. And I've heard some amazing stories about people living in the DP camps. I've met several survivors. Unfortunately, most of them have passed who were in DP camps after the war. In some cases, I met one individual who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. His name was Israel. He was a Polish Jew who was taken to the camps, eventually wound up in a camp, labor camp in Germany. And after the war, true story, he was in a DP camp, met a German woman, young German woman, a couple years younger than him. Uh, they ended up getting married. She wasn't Jewish. He married a German that he met while he was in the DP camp, doing some odd jobs and working in the city that he was outside of, and yeah, ended up immigrating to the United States with a German woman who, for the rest of her life, lived as a Jew. Um, but yeah, there were
Rabbi,
people who they were displaced from their homes and no home to go back to, and they were in these DP camps until they either could find a new country to move to, or um, in some cases decided to stay in those countries where they had been relocated. Yeah, yeah.
hold on. I want to make sure I'm up to you. Two things. It's interesting. Obviously you can't do it right now, but I'd like to see the migration patterns of different peoples throughout the ages, right? You can almost say the Jews were one of the first political and religious refugees and migrants, right?
Yeah, yeah, there is you can try to figure out how to I tried to generate one with AI, it didn't come out right. It really I gotta tell you, AI really blew this one. It wasn't even fixable. But yeah, to be able to show the circular migration pattern, because here we have Jews that were in Europe that are now coming back to Israel. So we have literally hundreds of thousands of Jews that in the period between, let's say, 1939 and 1948 were trying to make their way to Israel. And we know that under the British mandate, the British, and we're going to show the map in a second, the British would not let the Jewish people come and settle there. We know that. It's a historical fact. When people want to say, like, why did it happen? Again, we know British didn't want to alienate the Arabs. They needed access to the oil during the war. They had made promises back and forth on who's going to control that. I'm going to show you the map in a second. But the bottom line was it was not part of their policy was not to allow Jews to come there. And of course, in the United States, Jews cannot come either. Now, after 1945 and after the gravity, after when people saw on film, and remember, one of those people that was there filming this and creating documentaries of this was Alfred Hitchcock. He was there as a part of the war effort. He documented the camps, and when people saw the video, there was definitely a wave of guilt that came over Americans, and there were visas granted to people who had survived. It became easier in 1945 for some people to come to the United States. A little too late, right? Very little too, way too late. And 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 again, Britain is not allowing Jewish refugees to come to the country even after the war. And the great example of this that I like to share, of course, is Mina Hirsch, Eddie's mother, who was the only one of her five in her family. There was three girls. She had an older sister, a younger sister, both murdered. Her parents were both murdered. She was the only one who survived. And literally, as a 17-year-old girl, she was making her way to Israel. Her ship was taken by the British. She was put in a DP camp in Cyprus, which is where most of the DPs were in. If you watch the movie Exodus, it documents what was going on in Cyprus. Those camps were filled with Jews, many of them young people who survived as the only member. She's not the only person like that, who was the only member of her family that was still alive. And those DP camps were filled with thousands of Jews who were waiting to come in. Now, the pre-nation Israeli military, the Haganah, tried to smuggle these people in. There were many cases, and I had the good fortune of meeting some of the people who worked on bringing those ships. The Exodus 1947 was one of dozens of ships that was used by the Haganah to try to smuggle Jews in. And we'll talk about it in greater detail when we talk about Israel's history, but it was a amazing operation. In many cases, they knew they were doomed because they were on these ramshackle ships that had somehow survived the war. And by the way, many of the people who crewed those ships were American Navy officers, and many of those Navy officers were not Jewish, but they had seen what happened in the Holocaust, and they made sure that they could do something. And I met some of them just before they died. They're amazing heroes. And so after the war, they wanted to do more, and they wanted to do something. And they piloted these ships. Some of them, again, many of them that were brought to Cyprus. in the operations to try to bring Jews there. Many were smuggled in through those operations, but again, it was a drop in the bucket. Most of the mass immigration doesn't really get to open up until the founding of Israel in 1948. And of course, when that happens, we're going to have a whole nother influx of Jews from Arab countries. Now, we'll say that as this is happening, there's also some very dramatic things that are going on in the United States. And we're going to do another follow-up class on Jewish history in the United States. But for this context, what we're talking about here is the rise of American Judaism in in a major demographic shift. Let me just show you an example, especially those people who are from the East Coast will be a little bit more they'll be a little bit more sensitive to this, maybe, is we have an amazing shift of people. This is, for example, to look at one of those flow charts, John, one of those directional charts is what happens in New York City. Because in New York, we look at the fact that up until the mass migration of Jews, the immigration waves during the time of the pogroms, the people who came to the United States from Russia, from Poland, from Moldova, all those places, we go from having a Jewish population in the 1800s up through, again, the Civil War, where Jews barely make up 1%, to 1880, where Jews now make up 5%. Now, you can see what's also going on is New York is being flooded with immigrants, including people from Italy, people from all around the world. And even as the Jewish population is rising, the overall population in some cases is not as great because there are more immigrants coming from other places, and also Jews are now moving out of New York. Some of them were only there for a few years and then settled in other places, whether they went to Philadelphia or they went to Baltimore or they went to some of the other port cities, or they went even further west, started migrating, believe it or not, all the way across the West. They did come into New York, but many of them left. But as the Jewish community grows through what happens during this period, the Russian Revolution, another wave of Jews that comes from about 1900 to 19, really right up to World War I, the Jewish community now reaches its kind of pinnacle in New York City, where the Jewish community is almost 30% of the city. But of course, what's also happening is we start to have Jews moving from in the next decade, they're starting to move out of New York City, out of Manhattan, out of the Lower East Side in particular, and moving to places like Queens, Brooklyn, and of course, the Bronx. So in this period of time, we start to see Jews moving to areas like the Grand Concourse and of course Borough Park and all the places that you've heard of in Queens, Forest Hills. Some of those areas become Jewish communities overnight. Literally, entire areas, entire blocks become Jewish communities. Synagogues grow up in these areas where there never was a Jewish community. As people left the Lower East Side, again, and start filling up the other boroughs. And this dynamic of Jews living in New York City really continues, as you can see, all the way up through the 1950s and 1960s. When we get to the 2000s, when we get to kind of more recent times, you can see, when people say, like, how does someone like Mamdani win when New York is such a heavily Jewish city? Yeah, now it is, right? Compared to other cities in the United States, it's still anything over 10% is huge, but it's gone down a lot more than people realize from the peak in the 1920s and 30s, when the Lower East Side was such a vibrant Jewish community. And as I said, we're going to go back. We'll look at what happened in the urban cities, and we're probably actually going to do one class just on on Jews as an urban people. But this reality that the Jewish community goes down percentage-wise over half from where we were 100 years ago. So again, in 1925, the Jewish community was about 30% of New York City, and now it's under 15%. Again, still very high, but not what people think and not what people kind of remember and nostalgically about New York as the center for Jewish life. I'm not saying it's not. There's still so many Jewish institutions that are based in New York. There's so much Jewish life in New York, but percentage-wise, it's over half smaller than it was in the day. And that by the way includes the boroughs, the outer boroughs. And again, look, there's more Jews that live in Long Island today. There's more Jews that live in Westchester. And remember something, and of course, suburban New Jersey. And this happened in every city in the United States. I'm not saying New York because that was the only city. I'm saying it because it was the largest city and because you have 2 million Jews in the 1950s that live in the city of New York. I mean, that's amazing. In 1958, there are more Jews in New York City, literally, than in the nation of Israel at that time. At that time. So what we see is a Jewish community now in the United States. And again, this is kind of replicated around the nation, where we have suburban synagogues that are growing in the 1950s and 60s. You start to see more and more Jews affiliated with reform and conservative movements. And you start to see, again, as the Jewish community moves out to the suburbs, you see certain things happen that we haven't had ever, not just in America, but really in Jewish history, which is we start to have intermarriage rising as the Jewish community becomes less centralized, right? Less ghettoized, right? When Jews were all living in the Lower East Side, everyone you met was Jewish. When Jews are living in Long Island or they're living in San Fernando Valley, yeah, there's a lot of Jews, but there's also a lot of people that aren't Jewish. And so we start to see more and more intermarriage, and we also see the growth of secular Jewish identity, where people are now really identified as Jewish more out of an ethnicity and less out of a religion. Also is something that we also have to recognize, which is that as the Jewish community in some ways weakens its affiliation or weakens its observance of Jewish tradition simultaneously, and it's not, you have to understand what this does to us as Jews. We don't talk about it and we don't think about it. But as our affiliation and our observance is going down, our real power in this country is going up. And so more and more we have Jewish people that are taking leadership roles in politics, in business, even in, of course, during this time in sports. And you start to see Jews have a more visible role. And some people, again, call this the golden age of the Jewish community, but it also parallels some very interesting factors, including the fact that that Jewish religious observance is going down as that's happening. That's how we get to our modern era. That's how we get to where we are today as an American Jewish community. And so what defines to some extent the American Jewish community, at least until a few years ago, is a really, really, again, a disproportionate amount of affluence and a disproportionate amount of power. But at the same time, what we found is we don't necessarily always know how to exercise it, and we also don't know how to exercise it to our own benefit. As many people have pointed out, the Jewish community has been notoriously not protective of their own community, and we have to remember that there's a cost to that. There's a real cost to what we've done to ourselves by, to some extent, being courteous and not wanting to make noise. Now everyone goes, well, Jews are always making noise. Yeah, oftentimes we were making noise, but we're not making noise on behalf of ourselves. And many people have noticed that. Many people have said, we kind of become conditioned to, to being, to not making a big issue of our, of who we are, because, people won't like us, or people will think, think that we're being obnoxious, or that, that we're being too pushy. Whatever it is, there's a problem in that whatever happened to get us to this point, and it's a combination of a lot of factors. And so, part of it is I attribute the strength of the Jewish community in this country to a large extent because American Jews finally found a place where we, as with our values and with our interests and with our strengths, have found a place where we can be ourselves and where we're to some extent rewarded for what we've been for thousands of years. I hope by this point you can see that the strength of the Jewish people is our adaptability. When people talk about what's the secret of Jewish survival, what's the secret of the Jews, I would say there's several. You know, one of them being this belief that we're going to do better or that the next generation can do better, this hope. But there's also this adaptability, this power that we have to find ourselves in a new situation and then figure out how to best deal with that situation. And we do it very quickly and we do it more effectively than anybody else. And we had to as a matter of survival. And that adaptability in the United States is been, again, it's not a coincidence. This country is a country with tremendous potential, tremendous opportunity, but it also is a country where you have to be adaptable. You have to adapt. You have to be able to move with changing technologies, with changing demographics, with changing politics. And so this country rewards adaptability. It rewards it. Again, it's not, people say, well, Jews are smarter, Jews are not. There, again, I mean, you can look at the statistics, you can make the arguments about why this happens, why, Jews excel in certain fields, but the biggest issue is the adaptability. And this country rewards that. I'm telling you that because I've spent time. I've lived in England. I've traveled in a lot of places. None of the places, even the places that are close to us, like England, none of those places are move as fast and essentially make you change and adjust with something. England is a very static country. It's a country that feels very comfortable with people doing the same thing that they've been doing for 500 years. The United States doesn't really have that. So this country is constantly moving. People are always looking for something new, and we do really well with that. Now,
Rabbi,
yes.
I'd like to add to that, and we've discussed this and studied it actually. I think maybe you're correct in regards to adaptability and everything's fluid and it moves a lot quicker, but also we value education a lot more.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think maybe not a lot more, but we put a
Oh
big
yeah, no,
emphasis at
it's
least.
not just the adaptability. It's education. No, it's education. It's also this belief that we want the next generation to do better than we did, right? We believe that the next generation is should have at least as much opportunity, if not more, than what we've had. And I mean, we really believe that. There are cultures that, want people to look backwards. Judaism really does look forward. And again, this country is a forward-thinking country. So all of those things have bode well for us here. Obviously, we're seeing some things that we didn't think we'd see in our lifetime. Things that have matched, and have gone along with the rise of the strength of Israel. But one of the things that kind of determines the way we look at this phase of Jewish history. And in a moment, I'm going to go back to Israel. I'm kind of switching back and forth between Israel and the United States as the two countries and regions that have really determined the Jewish world in the last 75 years. We also have to deal with a Jewish community that, again, for much of the last 75 years, and you can make the argument, even though we've never seen so much anti-Semitism in this country, we're still dealing with a country and a community in the United States that has tremendous amount of power, a tremendous amount of power. Does it breed more resentment? Of course it does. Do I feel uncomfortable sometimes even saying it? Yes. But you can make the argument it's power that we've earned. It's power that we've worked really hard for generations to maintain and then to pass on to the next generation. But this was an article that was in the Atlantic magazine 2 years ago, which if you have Apple News, you can read it for free. Um, and then there's a link that I also will share to the story on their webpage, which you'd have to pay for. But this story, this piece written by Franklin Foer, is an amazing story of Jewish power, and then again, what happens when now in our own day, after October 7th, what happens to where we're at today, and the fact that things have changed a lot in the last couple of years, and so much so that somebody like this would say the golden age of American Jews is ending. Um, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that's the case, but there's definitely something different happening, and there definitely needs to be a new approach. One of the other pieces that I think came out recently that is also important for us to share, and we talked about it over the last few weeks, is so again, this is the end of the golden age, is also this really important right now podcast slash you can watch it on YouTube as well, is the piece from
You were listening to an Art Media podcast.
This is where it was on the
Jewish
Dan Senor site, but I will share this real quick. This is just from the last couple of weeks, and this is this was not done through Dan Senor's Call Me Back. This was done through the 92nd Street Y. This was done just 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago. This is the Brett
People.
speech.
Israeli Jews and diaspora Jews, observant Jews and secular ones, right-wing Jews and left, all of us ultimately in the same boat, whether we like each other or not, have the honor of being hated. Constantly seeking to prove ourselves worthy in order to win the world's love is a fool's errand. We need to stop being. I'd like you to know that the preponderance.
That's pretty much what you need to hear. I mean, you need to hear the whole thing. But anti-Semitism is something that we as Jews are not going to win the battle of making people less anti-Semitic. We need to focus our attention on protecting ourselves, educating ourselves, and also understanding that while we have to, again, understanding that people hate us means that we have to pay for security. And he talks about that there. He talks about the fact that everybody who came to hear his speech had to go through security. But the reality is that rather than spend our time, effort, and money on combating anti-Semitism, that we need to focus on the fact that these people are going to hate us no matter how much we spend to try to get them not to hate us. But we need to do a better job of educating and protecting and taking care of ourselves. So a lot of people were talking about it. It's definitely, I'll put it, I'll be sharing it up on our website, and I also will again, all I can do is encourage you. I know some of you have already heard it. I know John was the one who pressured me to make sure that I heard the whole thing. I mean,
have no idea
again,
honey and cinnamon can do.
I'm going to put it right here in the chat right now so that people from here can watch it. It's not very long. It's a half hour, and so it really does allow people to. It's a very well presented piece in that he doesn't belabor the point. He doesn't, he's able to get everything across in basically a half hour. So that's one place you can watch it. There's other places where the audio is available, but it's a very important discussion about what the Jewish community looks like now, in particular, in a post October 7th world, which again, we understand in America has created a different reality for us.
Rabbi.
Yes.
I just want to suggest to everybody, I mean, I know you're all adults and such. I shared it with almost everyone I know. Almost everyone I know. I have no idea who watched it, who didn't. I had a few people come back to me and say thank you. Some didn't say anything, but I know that the more we spread that one speech to me personally, different for everybody, of course, was probably one of the most important I've heard in my lifetime.
I think it's it's a great reminder of what we need to focus on, and as a call to action, I thought it was really good. Now, again, it was kind of important because we just watched literally, I think like a week before was the Super Bowl. It was really bad timing for Robert Kraft because his commercials, his organization that he's funding to combat anti-Semitism, where again he spent about $15 million in that campaign. And according to Brett Stevens, that was a waste of money. His call to action also, I'll put it as gently as I can. The ADL was not pleased because he basically called for the defunding of the ADL. So this is just it's a waste of time. It's a waste of money. Why spend money to try to get Gentiles to like us? It's not working. So it really did cause a lot of noise in the Jewish community. But I think overall it was actually a really important discussion. Even if you don't fully agree with it, it's a very important discussion to have. And I think again, there's going to be people that look back on it as a watershed moment for the way the Jewish community thinks about itself in this country. Again, is it a reflection of the lack of Jewish power, or is it more again a way of us understanding and kind of reprioritizing what our agenda should be? And that's really where he is. I mean, he's not saying that Jews should be not paying attention to anti-Semitism. On the contrary, he says we should protect ourselves and we should make sure that our institutions have the proper security and safety. But the idea that we're going to convince people not to like Jews, to change that, essentially says it's a fool's errand. So I will tell you, he definitely talks about the situation in New York. As a New Yorker, as someone who lives in New York, he's got an interesting feeling about that. And of course, and as we're going to go back to Israel now, when we talk about American Jewish history, and when we talk about Jewish history, which is what we're talking about today, the last period of 75 years, what goes on in Israel obviously affects us here in the United States. And it's obviously the most important thing that's happened in Jewish history in the last 2,000 years. The rebirth of Israel. And again, as we know, in 1948, and we'll look at it in greater detail, Israel comes into existence as an act of the United Nations. Again, essentially, the British throw up their hands and say, we're done. We can't do anything with it. Remember, after World War One, the Brits wound up with the area that they called the Mandate for Palestine, the British Mandate, which you can see is an enormous country. It's all of Israel, including the Golan Heights, including the Gaza, and includes all of what today is Jordan. Now, this land that is in the white in the middle was the land that in 1920 the British told the Jewish community of the world, this will be your country.
The whole
Yes.
thing?
Yes, all of it, including, as you can see, all of Jordan. All of Jordan. So how did this stuff here, which the Jordanians now call, of course, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, the Hashemites were a group of Arabs who didn't even live in Jordan. They were Arabian. They were allies of the British, and the British rewarded them with a country after the war, an entire country. They literally split this and said, you know what, this really doesn't need to be the Jewish homeland. And what, of course, the British did is they promised Jews and Arabs the same land. Now, even if this wasn't going to be the British mandate for the Jews, what the British did over the next 25 years was insane because they came up with several plans of how they were going to partition the country between the Arabs and the Jews, pretty much based on where the communities lived. Now, I will also tell you the Brits, really up until 1946, even after the war, were still thinking that they were going to maintain part of the country themselves. I know you didn't probably know that, And I know that you probably are going, really? Yeah. And the proof is, my friends, these maps that you see right here. Because every one of these maps you see, except for eventually the UN partition plan, which was voted on by the United Nations, not by Britain, every one of these where you see the part in orange, even if it's small, that's what the British were going to carve out for themselves. The British thought that they would be able to, on these maps, be able to control part of the land of Israel themselves. Um, None of these maps, obviously, are the maps that Israel is based on, right? None of these maps are what happens. But up until these three maps, and then this map that I showed you here, these are all British maps. The Morrison-Grady plan was kind of way the British came up with right after the bombing of the King David Hotel, when the British said, "Yeah, this is not working." Because remember, that was done by Jews. The Jews were the ones who blew up the King David Hotel. After, by the way, they warned the British to get out, to evacuate it. They then blew it up, and it was a act of Jewish terrorism. There's no question about it. It was done in a way that, again, was supposed to hurt the British, but not actually kill people. But the fact is that it was one of the last straws for the British, who said, "We can't, we
This was the
can't."
Stern Gang?
Uh, no, actually, in the
Uh-huh.
case in the case of the King David, it was the Irgun,
Okay.
which was Menachem Begin's
Okay.
branch of Jewish, the furthest right wing people. But wait, I mean, there the whole plan for there were more than just the Irgun knew about the King David operations. And remember, the King David Hotel was the headquarters for the British government. It wasn't a hotel. I mean, it was a hotel, but it was first and foremost the British headquarters for their colonial mandate. So it wasn't like they just bombed a hotel. It was the attack on the British headquarters. Um, the British, even in 1946, were still saying, we're going to have this corridor that goes from Jerusalem, and we're going to maintain control of Jerusalem all the way to Tel Aviv. We'll have that corridor, and the Jews will be on the coast, and they'll have this area in the Golan and the Galilee, where they live now, where they have the kibbutzim. But you can see the whole Negev, sorry, from Gaza down. And by the way, you can see every one of these maps. Gaza is not separated. On none of these maps is Gaza a separate entity, as an entity, right? This map has it as Arab in the 1947 partition plan, but um, yeah, it's not a separate. None of these maps is Gaza, as you can see, ever separated. But yeah, the British were going to control, according to the Morrison-Grady plan, they would have controlled the Negev, which is one of the reasons why Israel, after this period, starts to establish kibbutzim and settlements in the Negev, so that by 1947, by the partition plan, there are Jews living in the Negev to make sure the Negev never goes over.
Why
So
did the British want the Negev? It's just the arid desert, right?
because because their argument was well, I'm going to tell you why.
Okay.
Because they wanted to control part of the land, right? They wanted to control part of the land. And you just said, which is 100% true, it's desert. There was no one living there. So by claiming this area where no one was living, they were able to say, "Hey, look, no one was living there. We just took it over, but no one was there." So one of the reasons why the Jews settled there was so that, and they established kibbutzim there very quick in 1946. They wanted to make sure that that area became part of the partition that would be for the Jews.
Mm.
And so they worked around the clock to try to get water and to try to get settlements built there. And for those, I think John's the only person on the line right now that was with us when we went to this area where we stayed, when we stayed in Beersheba. We learned a little bit about how they very quickly established water and brought water down into the Negev so that the settlers could have these little outposts and these what eventually became these kibbutzim, like Ofakim and Sderot, some of these places that are the main Jewish hubs in the Negev, even of course not so much Beersheba, but the kibbutzim, that these places, because Beersheba is a city, but the kibbutzim were there, and that when we can get a map like this, now Israel actually has like a defensible territory. Because if Israel's just here and just here, it's not good, and there's no future for it. Did Israel think that they were going to wind up with the rest of this area, right? The rest of the Galilee, right? The Arab parts of the Galilee, and then this area here, with the exception of Gaza, which is the parts of the desert where there were Bedouin and the cities of Gaza and Ashkelon and those cities that have a Jewish have an Arab community. So if we look at the map after 1940 and 1948, this is the area that winds up being Israel after the war. So after the War of Independence, Israel winds up with everything in the Galilee, has a coastal route that connects it all the way down to Beersheba. But of course, the West Bank, the Golan, and Gaza are all part of Arab control. And as we've repeated many, many times, during this time from 1948 to 1967, this area of Gaza is run by the Egyptians. This area here, the West Bank, is run by the Jordanians. It is not given to the Palestinians. No, there's no Palestinian state here. There is absolutely never a Palestine established for 20 years in these areas. So you can see that the line here changes completely from what this would have been. And this country is much more defensible, and it's an area that, again, definitely includes a lot of desert in the Negev, but it is now a country that's all linked together. Which, of course, the one big loss during the War of Independence is Jerusalem, whereas all the new city becomes part of Israel. The eastern side and what is the old city falls into the hands of the Jordanians. And so until 1967, this was the map of Israel. When people talk about Israel going back to the map of 1948, this is the map. This is what the map would look like. So for people who went to Hebrew school in the 1950s or 60s, this was what the map looked like. This is, of course, not the map from 1967 on, right? Which I'm not going to get into so much today because it's not that it's not important, but it's not our focus. This country of Israel becomes a focal point for world Jewry. Now, when we talk about how do Jews in the world deal with how does a Jewish person in Russia live? How does a Jewish person in the United States live? How does a Jewish person in Australia live? Everybody from 1948 on lives with the knowledge that there's now a Jewish nation, a Jewish country, and that during the next, literally, as we know, over the last almost 80 years, Israel becomes a regional powerhouse. And so now we have to deal with the fact that Israel is a powerful country. And so how do Jews now deal with being in a situation where in the United States, they have some very strong financial and political power, and now in Israel, they have strong regional national power? How do Jews deal with now having some power themselves? And we can say that, look, it's not always been easy. The Jewish community is in the scope of Jewish history, this is still a blip. We have not had a long time to be weighing in on and agonizing and dealing with the benefits and the challenges of being a people with power. But for 2,500 years, the Jewish people have not had a monarchy, have not had Jewish power, have not had a Jewish army. And now, for the last 75 years, there's a Jewish army. And as we've just seen in the last few days, it's one of the most powerful armies in the world. And I didn't say it. I didn't say this. American officials have said it. that the two most powerful air forces in the world, the United States and Israel, are flying over the greatest aggressor in the Middle East with complete air supremacy, not superiority, air supremacy. And it was American officials who said that Israel's air force is the second greatest in the world. I don't look, you can debate it, you can argue it, doesn't matter. If it's not the second best, it's one of the top five, or maybe the top 10. I don't, whatever you want to say. But the Jewish people have an air force that's one of the most powerful air forces in the world. That's what this little country has been able to do in 75 years. So this is a new dynamic for us. We're still coming to terms with it. And look, some of this is not easy. I'm not going to say this has always been a wonderful thing to have this kind of power. But if you give me the choice between having no power and having power, I will take power. Because again, there's definitely things that we have to figure out. We're challenged by, how do we fight ethical combat, ethical war? How do we deal with, you know, being perceived as bullies? How do we perceive as as being aggressors? I mean, all of these things Jewish people never had to deal with, and now we do. And so we're coming to terms with it. We're learning how to deal with it. We're still we're still in the early days of the dynamic of Jewish power. But
Rabbi,
again, I'd like it to continue. I'm not arguing it for us to go back to the way we are in the least. Yes, Alan.
uh, my last 2 years, is 2.5 years as an undergraduate, my roommate was from Kuwait. And after the Gulf War, where the Iraqis invaded Kuwait and the Americans liberated it, I got this standing invitation to come to Kuwait. And I said, but I'm Jewish. He knows very well. And he said, yeah, but you're welcome because you're an American. I got an email 2 days ago. I got a text message today. Welcome as Jews in Kuwait right now.
Yeah. I, I can only tell you that I was very worried. And, when I was at Friday night services, I knew something was going to happen soon. Everybody did. I mean, you could hear they were telling people to get out of the country. So I knew, and I said, look, I don't know if it's going to be before Purim. I don't know if it's going to be after Purim. I don't know if it's going to be after Ramadan, but it's going to be soon. And I was very worried that there was no way that Israel would be able to achieve specifically the air supremacy that they had the last time. I figured they're going to have to they're going to adapt. They're folks. I don't want to say anything because I don't want to I don't want to jinx it, so to speak, right? But just not to have had pilot error or technical malfunction, folks. If an Israeli pilot has to eject over Iran, they're dead. Even if they land safely, they're dead. I mean, God willing, they'll be picked up by Iranians who want to get rid of their theocracy. But the other option is horrible. The being taken hostage by the Basij or the IRGC, it would be a nightmare. So um, I just can't believe it. I still can't believe it. I can't believe where we are a few days later that I don't know. I mean, none of us know how this ends. But if this ends with the end of one of the most destabilizing countries in not just the Middle East, but in the world, because they're responsible for Jewish deaths in South America. They were the ones who funded and trained the terrorists who blew up the Amia Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires. These are horrible people, horrible people. And anyone who doesn't understand that, anyone who wants to reject that, anyone who wants to soften that in any way is an anti-Semite flat out. Because if you can justify protecting people who've murdered our people, again, not least of all, murdering an entire battalion of U.S. Marines in Lebanon, because that was funded and paid for and trained by Iran as well. If you don't understand that, then there's really nothing to say. There's no discussion. You can't even argue with somebody like that. You just don't talk. I have nothing to say to you. But when we look at what will happen But we look at what could happen in the future. Look, we only hope that it'll be a new opening for Israel, for the West. I love the fact that Putin's allies are being picked off one by one. I hope Cuba goes next. I hope every one of these countries that's been part of what's been called CRINK, right? China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, that all of them should fall, and they should all be replaced by democracies and by countries where people cannot live in fear. I think this is. I mean, we hope that will happen, and I think we're on the right path, but I don't know. I hope. I I just want there to be an end to this as soon as possible and with the least amount of bloodshed on all sides. But I do want to tell you, these are the things that we are living through history right now. And these are the things that people go back and they'll look back 50 years from now and say, do you remember how this happened? We hope that people will look back on it and be able to say it all worked out well. You never know, folks. We sometimes we think the things that worked, that were done and it happened in the right way end up becoming the wrong thing because they end up starting something else. But we gotta hope that this is we know one thing for sure. The country of Iran is a evil country where people have been living in fear, and everyone said it, for 47 years, for 50 years, however you want to say it, it is an entirely evil country. And so the regime has been a complete nightmare for its people. And so again, hopefully the Iranian people will be free. And I hope it'll be good for the whole world. Not just Israel. I mean, I hope it'll be good for everyone in the world because it'll set a message
Rabbi?
saying, not going to let this happen anymore. Yeah.
Um, really, Phil Wasserman turned me on to Dan Senor's site. So for everybody here, if you've never heard of him, or I'm just telling you that the last three interviews are incredible, with people in the know, at least based on the conversations. You all should spend the time to listen to it. The most recent one was yesterday about the intel and it's just you gotta. I'd make the time if I was you. That's all.
It's not very long. The last couple of them have been like little half hour segments, and they are very chock full of interesting information. And again, they're right up to date. I mean, they're literally, like what happened yesterday. So
This is Phil Wasserman.
it's no, Philip was talking. It's called "Call Me Back" by Dan Senor,
Ah,
and so he's had some really interesting interviews, and again, he's bringing people on from Israel who know exactly what's happening and can articulate it really well for an American audience. Now, as we're looking at this along the backdrop of Jewish history, one of the things that we also have to remember is that there's still a Jewish community in Iran. It's not very large anymore, but again, it goes back 2,500 years. The interesting thing will be, will Jews feel strong enough, maybe some of them to go back to Iran? I doubt it. I mean, many of these families have been gone for 40 or 50 years. We had Neusha, who was there with her husband and her little son Levi, who were at Purim Monday night. She's been raised her whole life in the United States, but will some of her family go back? Will she be able to go back? Look, there were a lot of people in Iran that had the Jewish community was very powerful there, had gone, but you're talking about 2,500 years, literally since the time of Mordecai and Esther, people who had built businesses, who had family ties and ties to business that literally had been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. Jewish communities that were some of the more powerful Jewish communities in the entire world were in Iran. And so the Persian Jewish community has an amazing history. Will those places be able to be redeveloped? Will Jews be able to go there? Personally, I would love to travel to Iran. It's always been a dream to be able to go to Isfahan and go to some of the places where the Jewish community lived and thrived for 2,500 straight years. When we look at the map of the Middle East and we look at countries nearby Israel, for example, Syria, Damascus was a city that in the 1920s had 20%, roughly the same percentage as New York. Damascus was that almost that Jewish percentage-wise. Baghdad had a Jewish community that was between 10 and 15%. These cities had vibrant Jewish communities that in 1948 and really over the next few years were completely rid of their Jews because they had to flee. And people don't talk about that. They don't talk about what happened to the Jewish community, the Mizrahi Jewish community in Syria, Iraq, and again in Iran, where the majority of them fled. The majority, I mean, 90% of the Jews of Iran fled. They came to Israel, they came to New York, they came to Los Angeles. They fled that country after 2,500 years of living in that country. That's longer than our ancestors lived in Poland. Our families in Poland go back 1,000 years, which is a long time, but 25 over twice as long. And these families left everything, all of that history behind, all of that culture behind, all of that language behind. And as they came to the United States, and again, the Syrian Jewish community goes back even maybe even further back. The Syrian Jewish community goes back to literally the time of King David. There were Jews that were living in Damascus. When we think about those communities that were literally wiped out of their Jewish of any sign of Jews. Now, again, many were killed, but most of them fled. The one thing that differentiated what happened in the Arab and Islamic countries like Iran was that the Jews were allowed to leave. Now, they were allowed to leave with nothing. They had to leave all of their property behind. They couldn't sell their goods. They couldn't retrieve even pennies on their dollar, but they were able to survive. And for that, again, we can be grateful. It wasn't like the Holocaust, but it was very, very difficult. That families who had tremendous amounts of wealth, many of them came to Israel, many of them settled in Israel, and Israel as a new country took in hundreds of thousands and eventually over 1 million Jews from what we call Mizrahi Jews. Sometimes people call them Sephardic Jews. They're not really Sephardic Jews. They're Jews from this area, from the Middle East, Jews from sometimes they're called Jews from Arab countries. These people came to Israel with nothing and were literally living in refugee camps in Israel. The Mabarot. This was during the 1950s and all the way through to the early 60s. Jews from those countries were living in squalor. They were very, very poor. And it took a generation in some cases for those families to reach the level of income and the level of control in Israel that the Ashkenazi Jews who had been the original settlers were able to do. Well, I would say original settlers, the bulk of the original settlers. Many of the original settlers of Israel were Mizrahi Jews who made their way to Israel as well over the years because it wasn't far away. So there were Jews from Syria, there were Jews from Lebanon and Egypt that would constantly make their way to Israel and make Aliyah. But during this time, we had this wave of Jews that came from Arab lands who settled in the land of Israel, and it was a very difficult. It's been well documented. It's part of Israel's consciousness that it took a long time for Israel to have these communities integrated and to have the same educational opportunities, to have the same political strength. And again, there are parties in Israel that are the Shas party, for example, is solely for Mizrahi Jews. It's a party that represents Jews who come from these countries. But remember, as of today, as of this moment, there has never been a prime minister of Israel who's Mizrahi. So there is definitely a political difference between the strength of the Mizrahi and the Ashkenazi communities. Now, there has been a Mizrahi president of Israel. Actually, he was born in Iran, but the David Levy, but the level of income, the wealth gap between Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Jews was real. And everybody knows it. It's not a secret. It's definitely embarrassment to it, but it's partly because they were the newer immigrants. And in some cases there was definitely some bias, where people felt that, the Ashkenazi Jews who were in power were loath to give it up. And there was definitely some oh, I also should say the Yemenite Jewish community, which was a very large and strong community that all came to Israel in the 50s and 60s. These communities were in some cases, um, it was a difficult path for them. And one of the ways that Israel has helped integrate new immigrants is through the military. And the military is in many ways a great equalizer because um, everybody kind of starts out at the same level when they come into their unit. And so it was a way for Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Jews to start working together, start learning each other and becoming friends. It was a great way of integrating people because the units were always mixed. And of course, the language, the fact that after a few generations, everyone was speaking Hebrew. Many of these families were now intermarried. There was marriages between Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Jews. So there's a lot of people who have a grandparent who is from Bulgaria or a grandparent who is from Poland and a grandparent who was from Iraq or a grandparent who was from Yemen. So there's a lot of people now in Israel who have mixed identities, if you will. They have different Jewish identities. And so it's definitely changing, and there's more and more people that represent kind of both cultures. And again, very different foods, very different ways of approaching certain things religiously. The Mizrahi community was much more religious when they came, and so they kind of held on to the traditions a little bit harder than the Ashkenazi. Many of them who were secular or atheist. So there were definitely some differences there. And Israel's still coming to terms with that. And of course, after those waves of Jews, we Israel was then also had a huge amount of Jews, over 1 million, that came when the collapse of the former Soviet Union during the 90s, very late 80s, the beginning of the 90s, and into the 2000s, when again over 1 million Jews from Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, Uzbekistan, all of the republics of the Soviet Union came to Israel and made Aliyah. And of course, many came to the United States, but Israel was the main beneficiary of that wave of immigration. And almost simultaneously as that was happening during the 90s, there was the wave of immigrants who came in from Ethiopia, and over 100,000 Ethiopian Jews settled in the country at the same time. And it was very hard. I remember going there as a young person in my 20s, helping out. I spent a week helping out in the refugee caravans. These were mobile homes where the new refugees were staying, and they were much better than the refugee tents, if you will, that the people were in the 50s and 60s, the Yemenite and Iraqi and Syrian Jews. These were, for the most part, pretty nice mobile homes, but it was still a tough existence, and there was not always easy relations between the Russian Jews and the Ethiopian Jews, to put it mildly. There was definitely some racism and some problems there, but at least they found a home, and they were integrated. And again, when these people served in the military and were or had a chance to be there for now they've been in there for 30 years. There's a lot more integration, and and there's been some hiccups and some difficulties along the way, but for the most part, Israel has been fed with these new waves of immigration, so that today, we're very close to eventually having 10 million Jews in Israel, and then at that point, Israel has always already passed the United States as the largest Jewish community, which it did about 10 years ago. But eventually, again, we'll start to see the real numbers go up to the point where um, not only will there be 15, 20 million Jews, God willing, one day in Israel, but then in the United States, maybe it'll be 5 or 6 million. And if we hold our own, and then we become 25% or 20% the size of Israel, where right now, obviously, American Jews have a very strong voice in Israel because of our support, because of the amount of Jews that live in this country, because of the dependence that Israel has on the United States. But will that always be the case? The numbers don't seem to bear that out, but we'll see what happens. That's where we are today, folks. We're at a place right now where obviously the poles of America, American Jewish community, and Israel are really the determining factors in the Jewish world. Again, there's a couple 100,000 Jews in France. There's almost as many Jews, though not as many in England. There's a sizable Jewish community in Australia still. And there's a very large Jewish community of, when we add it up, a decent sized community in Russia and still, several thousand Jews in Ukraine. There are Jewish communities in other places, but if we add up all the Jewish communities in the world outside of Israel, they don't add up to how many Jews there are in the United States. So the United States has a very big role to play, our Jewish community in the world. But will that continue? Will that have will that be the case in a generation or two? I don't really know. That's kind of up to us. It's up to it's one of my goals, obviously, is to keep the American Jewish community strong and to have a role to play in the voice of the world Jewish community, which means to a large extent with Israel. So the United States having a role to play, especially with the Jewish community, is definitely one of the things that I try to do. It's why I spend so much time taking people to Israel and forging those relationships and making sure that Israel understands that American Jews care about them because they sometimes hear the bad stuff more than they hear the good stuff. And so they're concerned when they see, certain Jews, especially very high profile members of the Jewish community, um, bash Israel. And so we have, I have for me, it's a big, every time that happens, it inspires me to make sure that we have more people coming and for Israelis to know that we care. Look, we also are dealing with a reality, folks. And when we talk about the American Jewish community today, we're in a very interesting situation. Next week, we're going to talk about Christianity, the history of Judaism and Christianity. So the next history classes that we're doing follow chronologically to some extent, because when we talk about Jews and Christians, we're going back 2,000 years, all the way up till today, but we're going back 2,000 years. So when we talk about Jews and Christianity next week, we're going to talk about this a little bit as well. But I want you to understand that one of the interesting things that's happened in the last 20 years is that, and particularly, it's one of the things that the current prime minister of Israel, Netanyahu, has done. Netanyahu very rarely speaks to the American Jewish community. You just have to understand that. He doesn't really, and it's been discussed amongst Jewish leadership, he doesn't really care what I or what any rabbi or what the Jewish community leaders think about him. He doesn't care. And you can tell. He is primarily concerned with what the American Christian community thinks about him. And this is a frustration to people to some extent. I tend to be a little bit more realistic about it, more pragmatic about it. I get it. I would like to see him care about both communities, but he's definitely spent a whole lot more time making sure that he speaks to the American Christians than he does the American Jews. Now, you can make the argument he's made up in his mind that he can't pitch to American Jews who are more liberal than he is. That's possible. But he knows because, of course, as you know, he grew up in the United States. He lived here during his formative years of high school. And so he understands American psychology. He spent a lot of time in the United States. But it is frustrating to have the leader of Israel, our natural partner, be more concerned with how he's perceived in the Christian community. And that is one of the reasons why we live in a very strange world right now, where when we see something like what happened last week, where there was a discussion about closing off or I would not say closing off, it's already technically not allowed, but that women who pray at the wall could be jailed up to 7 years if they're praying at the wall. That only goes through or even has a debate if the prime minister of Israel doesn't really care what American Jews think. I know it's an incendiary issue. I know it's not really hopefully going to change anything, but the very fact that that's what's happening right now is upsetting. It shouldn't happen, and it shouldn't be. We shouldn't be wasting our time fighting and even being upset about this. But man, I got a letter from the Reformed Jewish community. I got a letter from some of the other organizations based in Israel, decrying what had happened. In the end, right now, nothing has happened. There's been no decisions made. There's not really been a change, but it hasn't been good. I mean, the 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 power that the religious parties have in the Netanyahu government is definitely something that's disconcerting for me. But it is ironic that we live at a time where the American Jewish community, I mean, I'm just going to tell you flat out, and I can tell you this because I talk to these people in the Israeli government. Uh, they are primarily concerned with making sure that American Christians um, are supporting Israel. Again,
Rabbi,
it's not going to affect our lives on a daily basis, okay? It's just ironic, and that's all I want to say about it. I don't want to dwell on it, and I don't want you to say, well, I don't like Netanyahu, whatever. It's not an issue. It's not my feelings about the guy are not an issue. It's just I'm pointing out the irony that we live at a time when the Jewish community in the United States is actually secondary to the Christian community when it comes to the support of Israel. And that's just a fact. It's a sheer numbers issue. It's not like Netanyahu says, I like Christians more than I like American Christians more than I like American Jews. But that's what we have. So yeah, John.
I was just gonna say, hold on, I gotta get it. I was just gonna say, Netanyahu has a large, correct me if I'm wrong, he has a large religious Orthodox
Yeah,
members of his government, because that was the only way for him to get his government
correct.
to stay in
Correct.
force,
Correct. So
right?
that's why he's not concerned with, he's not concerned if we make an issue of, you know, praying at the wall, he's not it doesn't he doesn't he's not going to waste time on that. And people will be like, why does he come out? He visits with Christian leaders, but he doesn't come out and visit with Jewish leaders when he comes to the United States. Look, it's a numbers issue. And again, I know people don't like it. I'm not making
It's more
excuses.
than that, Rabbi. Look what Schumer did today. Come
I,
on.
I know. And so some people would make the argument that the relationship is with the American Jewish community is at a low point. It's at a low point for a lot of reasons, and some people would say it's kind of inevitable. But it's oftentimes a leadership issue. It's an issue of the way leaders interact with each other. It's not like Netanyahu is disrespecting or disregarding you or me, but it is what it is, my friends, and understand that this is what underlies some of this some of these issues. And again, just as an example, I mean, again, whether or not Netanyahu can ever get Schumer to they be on the same page, they've had a up and down relationship. But is Netanyahu going to spend more time talking with Lindsey Graham or with Schumer? I mean, there's no question. It's a weird thing, is all I'm saying. It's not bad or good. I'm not making a value judgment. I'm just telling you that's the way it is. It's a very strange thing. And again, I'd use the word ironic that that the leadership of Israel now is placating more to that. And obviously it upsets American Jews, especially more liberal American Jews, because they don't like to see Netanyahu come to the Congress on look, I'm not value judging. I'm just telling you, when he came and spoke in front of Congress, that was seen as a disrespect to the president, to Biden. You have to understand why that happened, and that the fact that it happened. It's part of what's happened, and it's indicative of this of the relationship and the challenges of that. And so, does it make American Jews upset? Yeah, because on one hand we say we buy Israel bonds, we support Israel, and yet the prime minister of Israel is coming there to essentially undermine Biden, and that's what people felt. I mean, again, you can argue that that's not what it was. You can argue why it happened, but there were a lot of Jews who felt that that's what it was. So, why does it happen? Okay, I gave you some of the reasons.
I also think that he doesn't respect American Jews. I mean, he thinks we should all have done Aliyah. You know, we're living in the diaspora and we should be in Israel.
There definitely, Gail, there definitely is more. His diaspora chair, his head of diaspora affairs, has said that. So, he's had to step back and he's had to.
And then where would Israel be without us?
He's
You know,
had he's
without
had to
American
he's
Jews.
had to control that. But there definitely has been, I would say, the American Jewish community and Israel, to some extent right now, have never had a more contentious relationship. I obviously, it has a lot to do with American politics. It has a lot to do with Netanyahu. It has a lot to do with the personalities, as well as the situation we are at right now. But whatever it is, that's the way it is, and I don't like it. I'm not saying and I'm hoping that it won't stay like that. We have a prime minister who really understands the United States very well. He's not ignorant of it. You could say before Israel's made missteps because they've had prime ministers who don't understand America, who don't understand Americans, who don't speak to Americans right. That is not the case with Netanyahu. Netanyahu knows exactly what he's doing, and he knows exactly how to speak to Americans. I would argue he's more articulate. He speaks better to Americans than several of our leaders have proven. And people have said that. I've had many American Christians who say, I wish Netanyahu was our president. I wish we had someone as articulate, as coherent as he. And these are Republicans. These are evangelical Christians. These are people who are not the least bit Jewish who've said that to me. Again, I'm just telling you, this is where we are today. I'm not, I'm not saying it's better or worse. It should be or shouldn't be. I mean, there's definitely parts of it I wish wasn't. I wish the relationship was better. I wish American Jews were not as fractured right now on Israel. But I'm hoping that it'll change. I'm hoping when there's different leadership, I'm hoping that when there's different leadership in Israel and when there's different leadership in the United States, that we can go back to this. I want Israel to be a nonpartisan issue. I've said this before in our synagogue. I've said it numerous times. I don't want Democrats to feel like they have to be they have to make excuses for their party. I don't want Republicans to bash Democrats and say that your party hates Israel. I hope that comes to an end. I want Israel to go back to being supported by. I do not want to see the governor of our state say that he will never take money from AIPAC. Those kind of things are not good. They're never there's nothing good about that. And if you're a Republican, you're laughing at that and saying I told you so, you're missing the point. That never should have happened, and the fact that it did happen, we got to deal with it. It's not a joke. It's not a joke. I'm sickened by it, and I don't know how that's happened in 5 years. I do know how it's happened in 5 years, but I'm sometimes astounded by it. So again, I'm hoping there's going to be peace soon. I'm hoping that there's going to be a change in leadership all around, where people will start speaking to each other with more respect and with more dignity, even when they disagree with each other. And I'm hoping that Israel will no longer be will not become a partisan issue. Where again, bipartisan support will be the norm, back where it was 10 years ago, where Kamala Harris and Mike Pompeo came to the AIPAC conference and were both treated with respect, and both were there talking about how important AIPAC is. So I wanted to go back to that, and I'm hoping that it will go back to that. But again, it's not where we are right now. So good things, but also some challenging things. And again, we got to keep in our minds that we can do stuff in our own community. We can do stuff in our own conversations. We can do stuff within our own synagogues. And one of them is not to bash each other and not to say, look at your party stinks. You can say, hey, that person is not like the other people. Because for every person who says something stupid like Gavin Newsom, there's a Fetterman who says, you know, are you kidding me? You have to, you're going to make an excuse about Iran. And for every ignorant Republican like Thomas Massey or Marjorie Taylor Greene, there's somebody, you know, on the other side, on the Republican side, who's going to make an articulate case. You're going to have a person like, you know, Marco Rubio, who's going to remind people that Israel and America have common purpose. So again, every party has its problem, and every party has something to celebrate. We as American Jews and people who care about the Jewish community, who care about Israel, need to not bash each other every time somebody screws up, and remind people that your party has good people, and our party has good people, and our party has bad people, and your party has bad people. Let's be honest, and let's be embarrassed. As one of my great rabbinic teachers said, I don't care what party you're a part of, as long as you're embarrassed by it. So as long as you have some humility, and as long as you remember that, again, for every wacko Talib, there's a Tucker Carlson. All right, folks. The good news is we're here. We're celebrating, and hopefully, again, looking forward to even more freedom in the world as Jews and as people who love freedom, and who want other people to have the things that we've enjoyed as American Jews. We hope that one day maybe Persian Jews will have the same freedoms that we do, God willing. Inshallah. All right, folks, we will see you next week. As I said, we're going to look at Christian and Jewish history, where we departed from each other, where we diverged, and how we got to where we are today, which in some ways we're closer today than we have been in 2,000 years. We're back to almost in some ways where we were 2,000 years ago. So that'll be the next week, and we will be online. And in the meantime, please, everybody, stay positive, and it's still the month of Adar for another week, 2 weeks almost. So be very, very happy during Adar, and we'll see you soon. We'll see you soon, folks.
Bye.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Rabbi.
Rabbi.
Bye,
Goodbye.
Thank
everybody.
you.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night. Good night.
Mhm.